Okay, please let me know if you're not able to see the screen. Okay, so again, I'm Christina Staten with the Montana Department of Environmental Quality, project coordinator for the Madison TMDLs. The purpose of this meeting is to go over the draft Madison Sediment and Temperature TMDLs and Water Quality Improvement Plan. Christy Meredith and I will be discussing the main contents of this document and answering questions at the end of the presentation. And we're going to start by, I'm going to talk about the basic water quality planning process that DEQ follows for most projects of this type. Then I'll give a really short project overview and a history timeline. And I'm going to talk about the general steps to TMDL development. Then Christy Meredith is going to talk in more detail about the sediment and temperature TMDLs. And then I'm going to wrap up briefly with the next steps for completion of this document and how to submit comments that you may have. I'm also going to go through the project website for anyone that may not be familiar with that. If you haven't been there yet, that's how you access the document, and information on submitting comments is there as well. Okay, DEQ for every water quality project of this type, DEQ follows 4 main steps. First is the establishment of water quality standards. For most projects, this is already developed, however, including this project, excuse me. So for most projects, including this one, water quality standards have already been set. Therefore, for the Madison TMDL project, we began with the monitoring and assessment phase. Collected data was compared to the water quality standards and what is called a water quality assessment. This is to determine if impairments exist. Water bodies that were determined to be impaired for a pollutant are added to Montana's list of impaired waters, and those require a TMDL to be developed. The most common pollutants for Montana include sediment and temperature, which we'll be discussing today, as well as nutrients, which is nitrogen and phosphorus, metals, and pathogens. And we monitor E. coli to determine if there are pathogens in the water. Once a TMDL is developed, it can be used to help inform restoration priorities for the watershed. And as this slide notes, this is an adaptive process. After enough water quality improvement projects have been put in place, DEQ may come back to monitor and reassess streams to determine if they are now meeting water quality standards and if they can be removed from the impaired waters list. Excuse me. Other outcomes may include revising the TMDL or possibly revising the water quality standards. However, neither of these outcomes are generally common. Excuse me. I needed to grab a sip of water. So specifically for this watershed, or for this project, here's a map of the watershed, which shows that the Madison River forms within Yellowstone National Park. But I want to point out that for this project, we only included the area of the watershed that falls within the state of Montana and not the area within the park, which includes the actual headwaters, and not the area within Wyoming. Hopefully this whole map is visible to you. I need to move my bar. So we addressed 20 tributaries for this project, in addition to looking at the main stem of the Madison River. I'm just going to read these off. Starting in the northwest corner of the watershed, we looked at Hot Springs Creek, North and South Meadow Creeks, Moore Creek, Blaine Spring Creek, Wigwam Creek, Ruby Creek, Gazelle Creek and the Elk River, Beaufort Creek, which is a tributary to the West Fork of the Madison River, as well as we looked at the West Fork itself. Then we looked at Antelope Creek and Watkins and Red Canyon Creeks, which are tributaries to Hebgen Lake. Then moving northeast, we looked at Indian Creek, Bear and Odell Spring Creeks, Jack Cherry, and Elk Creeks. All of these streams are discussed in the TMDL document, but not all of them received sediment or temperature TMDLs. Okay, a project history timeline that follows the water quality planning process that I talked about. From 2012 to 2015, we conducted the water quality monitoring for this project. And in that process, we looked at sources of pollutant loading and quantified loading from those sources. In 2016, the water quality assessments were performed and impairment determinations were made. Then skipping ahead, well, we began writing TMDLs after that, and skipping ahead to 2019, we published TMDLs for the nutrient, E. coli, and metals impairments that were determined. And this year, we are finishing up TMDLs for the sediment and temperature impairments. Our goals for this project are not only to develop approvable TMDLs, but also we want to provide information that will help protect water quality in the watershed, and we want to provide water quality restoration suggestions. And this information is included in the TMDL document itself. So what is a TMDL? It stands for Total Maximum Daily Load, and is the maximum amount of a pollutant that a water body can receive and still meet water quality standards. And I have 3 pictures on this slide to help demonstrate the concept of a TMDL, which you can think of as a pollution diet or a pollution budget. In the bottom left, there is a bar graph that represents the total load of a pollutant within a water body. And the green portion of this graph represents the determined TMDL, or the allowable load. And therefore, the purple portion at the top of the graph represents the amount of the pollutant load that needs to be reduced to meet the TMDL and therefore to meet water quality standards. And the top right, there's a picture of a donkey that's attached to a cart, but he's up in the air because this cart has exceeded the maximum load that the donkey can pull. So there's too many boxes on this cart for the donkey to be able to pull it. In order for the donkey to be able to pull the cart, you have to remove some of those boxes to meet its allowable load, or its maximum load. And in the bottom right, there's a picture of a bridge and a sign that says, load limit 1 person at a time. So 1 person is the maximum weight that this bridge can afford. And if more than 1 person is on, sorry about that noise, that's my cat moving around here. If more than 1 person is on the bridge at a time, that may exceed the bridge's maximum weight capacity and it may break. So there are 5 main steps that we follow within Montana to develop TMDLs. The first, and I'll go through each one of these. The first is to define the water quality targets that we're going to use. The second is to define the TMDL itself, or the allowable loading rate. Then we determine sources of that pollutant loading. And then we determine the allocation to those identified sources. And finally, we develop the water quality improvement recommendations. On this slide, there's a picture of I believe this is a tributary to Blaine Spring Creek, and this is a road crossing where an unpaved road sediment assessment is occurring. And that happens to be Jordan Tollefson in the photo. So the first step is determining the water quality target, which represents conditions where the applicable water quality standards are achieved. Where a numeric standard exists, that typically becomes the target, and a numeric standard is basically a number. Where only a narrative standard exists, DEQ develops targets that translate that standard. And a narrative standard is a written description as opposed to a number. This is the case for sediment. Sediment only has a narrative water quality standard, while temperature has both a narrative and a numeric standard. However, we still develop targets to translate temperature's narrative water quality standards, as was the case for this project. So 2 examples of that. For sediment, a water quality target that we developed is for in-stream fine sediment, which is the amount of fine sediment that's on a stream bottom within riffles or within a pool. And the picture in the lower left of this slide is of a grid that's been tossed into a pool, and it's a way to measure fine sediment on the stream bottom. Another example for temperature is we develop percent shade targets. And I have an example of this for North Meadow Creek. Even though North Meadow Creek is not impaired for temperature and we didn't write a temperature TMDL for North Meadow Creek, I thought this was a good example of what meeting a shade target might look like, because this has healthy riparian vegetation that is adequately shading the stream. So the second step is to define the total maximum daily load, or the allowable rate. The methods for this vary by pollutant type. However, it is always defined by the target values that are developed and stream flow. The third step is to determine the sources of the pollutant loading. And as I said, this was done during the monitoring phase of this project. We also did a source assessment and quantified loads from what we thought were the most significant sources. And I have a few examples on this slide. And the top right of the 4 pictures is a picture of Cherry Creek. And the source here of sediment is an eroding stream bank. However, what's causing the sediment to be eroding into the stream was cattle access to the riparian area. And you can see that healthy streamside vegetation has been diminished or completely removed, basically, in this case, and the stream bank is eroding and failing due to cattle access trampling that stream bank. In the bottom right, there is a picture of sediment making its way to South Meadow Creek via runoff from an unpaved road, even though you can't see the creek in this photo. In the bottom left, this actually is not within the Madison River watershed. This picture was taken in the Bitterroot in southwestern Montana. We have an irrigation pipe that's running across the stream, and there is a return of irrigation water flowing into the stream, which is most likely warmer water than what's in the stream, and is most likely elevating the temperatures of that stream, or the temperature of the stream. And the top left, this picture also is not within the Madison watershed. This picture was taken in northwestern Montana in the Tobacco River watershed near Eureka. And this shows where timber has been cut within the stream corridor. And the issue with this is a buffer was not left between where the timber was cut and where the stream exists, which has taken away all the shading vegetation along the stream, and stream temperatures are most likely rising because of it. And the fourth step is how to allocate the allowable load to those determined sources. So I have a conceptual diagram here that represents a sediment TMDL for this project. And it shows that 3 sources were determined for the sediment TMDL, and they are stream bank erosion, unpaved roads, and upland erosion. And this is just a concept or an example of how it might be divvied up among all 3 of those sources. Now, how the allocations are achieved is dependent on whether the source is regulated. In this particular watershed, all of the sources identified for this project are unregulated sources, and therefore implementation of water quality improvement practices is voluntary. A regulated source is one that is permitted to discharge a pollutant into a surface water or groundwater. And as I said, we don't have any regulated sources within the watershed that are discharging sediment or elevated water temperatures to the streams that were studied for this project. I put 3 examples on this slide to show what some of the voluntary actions could be. The top is of a fencing project, and it's demonstrating that on the left side of the fence, within the stream corridor, we have a little bit healthier vegetation. This is probably a relatively new fence, and over time, this vegetation is going to become healthier, and it's going to provide additional shade to the stream and also additional filtering capacity to filter out pollutants from the upland. In the bottom left, we have what's called a water gap. And you can see in this photo, there's a cow that has access to the stream within this gap, which is fenced off. And where the cow has access, you can see that that stream bank is denuded of vegetation and is eroding sediment into the stream. Whereas on both sides of the water gap, we have healthy vegetation that's mature as stabilizing stream banks, preventing erosion, and also providing additional shade to the stream. And the bottom right, this is an example of off-site watering, which is ways to provide water to livestock without allowing them direct access, or possibly just to limit their access to the riparian corridor where they may degrade streamside vegetation. Now, the final step that I talked about is developing those water quality improvement recommendations. For this document, they're contained in sections 9 and 10. Section 9 is called the Water Quality Improvement Plan, and it contains recommendations for all the different types of sources that were identified in the Madison River, and more than what I've talked about in this presentation so far. Section 10 is called Monitoring for Effectiveness, and this includes recommendations for any additional monitoring that occurs in the watershed. We have recommendations for what to monitor and possibly where to monitor that. And I know that the Madison Conservation District has a stream team of volunteers that go out and monitor water quality on an annual basis. Hopefully this section of the document will provide some guidance for them that may be helpful. The number one factor in this watershed that can improve stream health for most of the streams is improving riparian grazing management practices. And I have a picture here of Red Canyon Creek watershed, which is a tributary to Hebgen Lake. This is a really good example of showing how fencing can protect streamside vegetation. As on the left side of the fence, you see that the riparian vegetation is very healthy, has good buffering capacity, and is providing shade to the stream, even though you can't see the stream in the photo. On the right side of the fence, the riparian, or excuse me, not riparian, but the vegetation is heavily grazed and is less healthy. The document also talks about other practices though, and these include urban streamside vegetation management. This is of particular importance to Moore Creek, which flows through the town of Ennis. And this just talks about maintaining healthy streamside vegetation as opposed to clearing it away for yards or lawns. The document also talks about irrigation water management to maintain minimum flows within some of the streams and to maintain cool water within the streams. And then we also recommend educational and responsible streamside recreation. And this is for recreationists and fishermen who access the stream by walking along the stream bank. Sometimes this can cause degradation to the stream bank, and we just are recommending education on how to minimize those impacts. To supplement this TMDL document, we're developing what's called the Madison Watershed Stream Summaries. Now, this document is going to be published separately from the TMDL document. However, it's going to discuss, it's currently under development, but will come out at the same time as the final TMDL document is published. It's going to have a 2-page summary of every tributary, all 20 tributaries that were monitored for this project. It's not going to discuss the Madison River, however. It'll also include a map of all of these streams, a general discussion of the main pollution problems, and a glossary will also be included to help the reader. This is an example, a screenshot that I took. This one's for Antelope Creek. The summaries will all look very similar to this. On the left-hand side, there will be a description of the general pollution problems for that stream, and then a description of the basic solutions to address those problems. And then down at the bottom, we're providing recommendations to focus restoration efforts. Each stream summary will have at least 3 photos demonstrating some of those water quality problems. And on the right side, you see on the bottom, there is a map, and that's going to show all the monitoring locations where we use data for this project. In this particular example, there's only 2 sites, and they're both DEQ sites. But if there were monitoring locations with data from the U.S. Forest Service or the Madison Stream Team, those will also be included on the map. And the bottom table is lat longs for each of those sites, and it defines what was collected at each site. And the table at the top of the page is to be used for watershed restoration plan development, which I'll talk about in just a second. But this table directs the user to specific locations within the TMDL document itself to gather information for that WRP, or watershed restoration plan. I know that the Madison Conservation District has already begun work on a watershed restoration plan and has made quite a bit of progress on that. So it's a locally developed plan that is DEQ approved. And once you have a DEQ approved plan, this opens up additional funding opportunities specifically from DEQ. And a watershed restoration plan provides information on restoration objectives and priorities. So the funding that I'm talking about is through the 319 program that DEQ administers. We receive, on average, around $1 million every year from the US EPA through a federal grant. And we allocate this money through a competitive process. We put out a call for applications every year and then review those applications and reward and award contracts between around $50,000 and $300,000 a piece. And like I said, once you have a approved WRP, you are, this opens up this funding to you. And that is all I have on this. And Christy's going to talk about sediment TMDLs next. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Does anyone, there it is. Okay, does anyone have any questions?
How many, this is David Laufenberg, Christina. How many different WRPs have been completed and submitted and accepted by the state at this point in time? Do you know?
Eric, are you still on the call? Eric would happen to, he would have a better idea of this than me.
Okay.
It's close to 40. I don't remember the exact number.
Oh, wow.
But it's on, they're listed on our website and you can look through them. Some are older and less detailed. If you're looking for ideas, I'd say look at some of the newer ones.
Very cool. So maybe Beaverhead or Gallatin have one fairly updated or recent that would be of comparable and useful sort of backbone for some of my efforts.
Those are good ones, and I can follow up and send you a link to those as well.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thanks, Eric. Man, it sounds like we're maybe a little late to the show if there's already been 40 developed.
Well, not necessarily. I think you guys have made really good progress on the plan that you've started working on. And one of the hangups is the WRP requires information from completed TMDLs. So at this point, we only have the nutrient, E. coli, and metals TMDLs that were completed. So I know that information from the sediment and temperature TMDLs was still lacking for your WRP. So you're not necessarily behind the curve.
Right on. Well, thank you. We'll put the TMDLs to use then.
I think Hannah just put up a link to the TMDLs in the chat too.
Oh, great.
Or sorry, not the TMDLs, the restoration plans, I mean.
Thank you for doing that, Hannah. Let's see, were there any other, Christy, did I miss any questions or comments in the chat? Doesn't look like I did. Are there any other questions? Okay, Christy, if you want to go ahead and share your screen again to start with the sediment TMDLs.
Okay. So thanks everybody. I'm going to continue this presentation regarding the TMDL process and our findings for the sediment and temperature TMDLs. Oops, hold on. Okay. Oh, there it goes. Okay. As many of us are definitely aware, we know that too much sediment can cause changes in composition to the stream bottom and alter channel form and function, and ultimately affect aquatic life. As Christina mentioned, the TMDL process involves determining the water quality targets, whether they are exceeded, what the load would have to be in order to meet these targets, and also the sources of loading. And then once we have the TMDL developed, a watershed restoration plan can then be developed and implementation objectives can be made. And then this process can continue until ultimately a stream may actually get off the impaired water bodies list if it's shown to not be impaired. However, with regards to temperature and sediment, we don't necessarily have a target concentration that we have for metals, such as 1,000 micrograms per liter for iron. We know that's a definite target. We have a different kind of target, which basically says, what would we expect if there were more natural conditions that were being represented in the stream with limited upstream sources? The sediment standard essentially says that there should be no increases in sediment above the naturally occurring concentrations, which are likely to harm beneficial uses. So in practice, we have to come up with a way to translate this statement into something that can be measured in the field. And what we do is we can compare values measured in the field to what is found at streams with minimal anthropogenic impacts, which are the reference sites. So some of the parameters of interest that we use in developing these targets are the amount of, as Christina mentioned, the amount of fine sediment in the bottom substrate of the stream, which is used by spawning trout. We don't want too much fine sediment, which can deplete them of oxygen and lower their survival. We also look at the channel form of the stream. A stream that's too wide might indicate that sediment has been eroded from the stream banks. In-stream habitat, such as deep areas, pools for trout to use, and then also the riparian health, basically the vegetation in the riparian zone. But when these targets are evaluated, just not meeting one target isn't enough. A stream has to basically not meet multiple of these targets, or not meet targets in multiple locations in order to be considered impaired. Here's an example target. No more than 15% of the pool tail in those areas where trout spawn can be filled with fine sediment. Here we can see on the right an example picture without much fine sediment, on the left a picture with more fine sediment. And this is an actual target that we have for low gradient streams, because it's been shown that reference streams did not tend to have values above this. So the sources of sediment that we evaluated, basically they include natural erosion, but then what we're interested in a lot in developing these TMDLs is the amount of sediment from roads and road crossings. Also stream bank erosion, mostly due to lack of vegetation in the riparian zone. And then upland sediment sources from different grazing practices, timber, and crops. So this is just an example of what a type of load allocation would be. So we might have a desired condition for a road, which would be the amount of sediment that would enter the stream if we had BMPs. And then we have the existing condition, which is the amount of sediment that's entering the road or entering the stream from the road now. And so what we're interested in is what % of sediment would have to be reduced to get to that desired condition. So sediment TMDLs were developed for these streams in yellow. And then there were several streams that were evaluated for sediment, but no TMDL was found to be needed because they did not fail those targets. And those are the streams here in blue. Some of the streams that were not impaired for sediment were impaired for habitat or streamside vegetation alteration, but we don't develop TMDLs for those. Many of those impairments can be addressed, however, by basically the same types of improvements that you would do to meet the sediment TMDL. So now I'm just going to go over how we did these different assessments. First, I'm going to start with the gravel roads assessment. What we used is a watershed erosion prediction model where we went out and surveyed crossings and parallel road segments in the watershed that were representative. We didn't sample all of them, but we basically took a random sample and went out to those locations. This is a Forest Service developed model where you basically put in the conditions of the road, the surface of the road, the grade of the road, whether there are BMPs in place, and you run the model to determine how much sediment loading there is to the stream. Then we would rerun the model if there were additional BMPs to see what that difference in sediment loading is. And then we could extrapolate to places in the watershed where we did not do sampling. This is just an example of some of the, or basically the actual distribution of road crossings and parallel road segments that were of gravel roads. So a parallel road segment would be a section of 100, or a section of road within 100 feet of a stream where that sediment could go into the stream. So we found 562 gravel crossings across the study watersheds and 992 parallel road segments. The highest loading was in high elevation public lands, and then slightly lower loading in low elevation lands or crossings in this area. The results of the assessment show that the biggest reduction potential in terms of ton per stream mile was in the South Meadow Creek, Red Canyon Creek, and Blaine Spring Creek. But if you go into the TMDL document, it explains a little bit more about the different, basically how much loading was found for each of these different streams and why these had some of the higher levels of loading. This is just an example of some of what was observed, some highly erodible surfaces, absence of diversions or vegetation to keep that sediment from entering the stream, and then areas of high bank erosion where that basically the sediment from the bank was going right into the stream from the road. And all of these are opportunities where different projects could be done to reduce the amount of sediment going into the streams. Next, I'm going to talk about the bank erosion assessment. For this, we use the banks model, which basically involved a bank erosion hazard index, which is essentially where you go out and sample banks within different stream sections and look at whether the banks are covered in roots, the height of the bank, different characteristics to come up with a likelihood of erosion, and then also the near bank stress, which basically how much energy is put on that bank during high water flows. And you can see from the pictures of the near bank stress that the stream with high banks will generally, depending on the angle and how that bank is oriented, have more potential for erosion during high flows. We did not sample every section of the watershed. We had 42 different basically sites or reaches that we went to in order to estimate the amount of erosion using this model. The results showed that higher gradient streams had less bank erosion and lower gradient streams had more bank erosion, which has been generally found in other similar studies. Also, these streams that were unimpaired, because we also sampled unimpaired streams, had lower bank erosion, which wasn't surprising, but these also had more of the riparian zone intact. So basically, statistically, we could show that these areas with at least 75% of the riparian zone intact or more representative of natural conditions had less bank erosion. This information could be used to estimate bank erosion if BMPs were implemented. So this is an example of Elk Creek on the left. We have gradient represented by the basically the dashed or solid black lines, and then basically red meaning poor riparian health and green meaning good riparian health. So if we were to change that riparian health to good, and then use those values that we collected in the field, we could then estimate the lower bank erosion with BMPs, and then do this for all of the watershed to get those values. So the results of this bank erosion assessment suggested that some of the areas with the biggest opportunity for lower erosion with BMPs, at least for the banks, were Moore Creek, South Meadow Creek, Elk Creek, Blaine Springs Creek, and Red Canyon Creek. So again, all the data related to this data collection is in the document, and also more information regarding what was found for these different streams. Some of what was observed was hummocking, where basically trampling had created uplifted areas that eventually were going to erode into the stream. Just really steep banks, such as in this example from Cherry Creek, high embeddedness areas where the substrate on the bottom was completely covered in fine sediment, but then also many really good observations of low embeddedness or good riparian vegetation also. So a lot of these streams had good areas where, they did not have a lot of bank erosion, but then they had areas where there was a lot of bank erosion and more opportunity for projects. Finally, the third source of erosion that was investigated was upland erosion. Just a general survey of the area found that most streams had adequate upland erosion or upland conservation practices going on. So basically, most of the erosion could be covered by the bank erosion model. The exception was Elk Creek, which had fairly widespread erosion from the uplands. So another model was used to basically estimate how much erosion would be going into the stream given the current cropland practices by actually basically digitizing where those fields were, basically looking at the crop cover and the width of the riparian zone, and using a universal soil loss equation model, predicting the amount of erosion into the stream. Then basically by changing what the crop cover would be if BMPs were in place, or the width of the riparian zone would be, the amount of reduction in erosion could be estimated. And this was estimated to be potentially 30% of the erosion could be reduced if BMPs were put in place for Elk Creek. So what we're left with after all these models, which are just a representation of reality, and just to get a general idea of what these sources of erosion are and to make our allocations, is the amount of load that is coming from roads, eroding banks, and upland erosion. And here's an example for Elk Creek. We can see that the eroding banks has the biggest contribution, and this was true across the watersheds and is generally the case, but in isolated smaller areas of the watershed, roads and upland erosion can have a big impact. But the largest was from eroding banks. In general, we talk about loading from sediment in terms of yearly annual loads, but we also do include in the document the estimated daily loads for sediment, which we are required to do. But a lot of times it's more useful to look at the load allocation or percent reduction than the actual value. So next I'm going to move on to talk about our TMDLs for temperature. As most of us are aware, given our chosen professions, high thermal loading may increase water temperatures to levels that harm fish and aquatic life. And in Western Montana, the TMDLs for temperature are associated or developed because of the impact to aquatic life beneficial uses. It's the same process that we use for the other TMDLs. However, when we think about temperature, we're not actually interested in the actual temperature itself, but the amount of heat load to the stream. So temperature is kind of a proxy for this heat load, and we're interested in understanding the sources of this heat load and how to reduce them. The standard for temperature that we have at DEQ is a 1 degree Fahrenheit maximum increase above the naturally occurring temperature for cooler streams below 66 degrees Fahrenheit, and then a 0.5 degrees allowable increase above naturally occurring for warmer streams. However, in practice, this is really hard to determine without very complicated models whether the standard is being met. So what is generally used is basically developing kind of basically allocations based on what, if you did certain actions, how would that influence temperature? So the recommendations that are made are to increase shade similar to natural conditions, to reduce the depth of, the width-depth ratio so that the width was basically decreased to be similar to reference range, and then to increase stream flow by 15%. And if you do these, this should decrease temperatures to near natural conditions. TMDLs were developed for Cherry Creek and Elk Creek and Moore Creek, which are on the impaired water list for temperature. Also on the list are West Fork, Madison, and Lower Madison, but no TMDL has yet been developed. Basically, taking these off the list would require more complicated modeling efforts, but these are, the data related to these streams is located in the document. So as part of this effort, continuous temperature modeling was done in 2013, as well as some stream flow measurements at various time points throughout that summer, and also measurements of shade. So on the left is somebody collecting stream flow using a typical Marsh-McBurney type flow meter, I believe. And then on the right is basically a solar pathfinder, which can be held into the stream at different points to determine the amount of shade that, or sunlight hitting the stream, and then also the amount of shade during a certain time of day. And then using that information, you can estimate the amount of shade that would hit the stream during other times of day, and essentially the total amount of shade versus solar radiation in a day. This actually correlates very well to data collected via GIS. So essentially, there's a program in GIS where if you know the vegetation in the riparian zone, it can estimate the amount of shade hitting the stream based on a variety of factors, including the angle of the sun, where you are in the earth, the elevation, etc. And these are very closely correlated. So this information was used to basically predict what the shade could be versus what the shade was. So there's basically published curves indicating the type of vegetation that would be expected given certain aspect elevation and ecoregion in Montana. And then we know what the elevation is, and in GIS that could be altered to predict what the shade would be if it more closely approximated natural conditions. So this is just an example from when Moore Creek in the document, showing in yellow and orange the shade deficit, so the difference between what the shade was and what we would predict it might be under more natural conditions. And so this was key in developing the shade TMDLs and basically supporting that Moore Creek is impaired for temperature largely due to shade. But in order to support this even more, an actual fall 2K temperature model was developed to predict what would happen if shade was increased for all three of the creeks, but I'm going to talk about Moore Creek. So this model takes into account solar radiation, vegetation in the riparian zone, or basically shade, basically the temperature upstream of going into a certain reach, and then the flow of the water. So you basically just put in your information into an Excel spreadsheet, upstream temperature, hourly shade, width of the stream, etc., and it will basically run this model for you. So I'm just going to talk about the results in relation to Moore Creek. In the white points, what we see is the daily maximum temperature along the creek during the warmest day of July in 2013. And in basically the line represents the modeled temperature just to indicate that the model did okay at approximating what the temperature actually was. Then if we were to put in what we think the shade could be, given some restoration, we can predict that the shade would decrease by about 5 degrees, or shade would decrease temperature by about 5 degrees, and adding an increase in flow did not have a huge impact on that decreased temperature. Putting in one of the basically limits for cutthroat trout, they tend to like streams below 73 degrees. Well, not just tend to like, they tend to survive better in those conditions. We can see that adding the shade that we recommend would get the stream more close to those conditions and would actually improve conditions for cutthroat trout. So this just supports the benefit of shade in this case. And in the document, we do have these model results for Elk Creek and Cherry Creek as well. So now that I've talked about the temperature and sediment TMDLs, I just want to mention that these streams and some of the other streams we evaluated are impaired typically also for alteration in streamside vegetation and flow modifications as well. And some of the streams that were not impaired for sediment or temperature are impaired for habitat type impairments. So any of them basically actions that you can do to improve sediment and temperature can also be used to improve these other impairments. And as Christina said, the #1 recommendation is continued riparian restoration, which is already being done in these watersheds, but just to continue that. Also, I think, you know, there could be additional focus on prioritizing areas in terms of riparian health, because what we did was more of a, you know, a GIS analysis, but increased visits and on the ground work would help here. Prioritizing areas for gravel roads projects. There does appear to be some effect of groundwater on the temperatures in these streams, and so that could, you know, involve further study, understanding obviously irrigation efficiency, how that could increase flows, because many of these streams do go dry, at least some of them during the summer. And then long-term monitoring, especially with climate change and as this watershed continues to develop, will also be critical. And I guess that's all I have. Open up to questions.
Hey, Christy, I've got a question. On some of the non-sediment impairments for, say, Odell Spring Creek, there was one that was other substrate modification. Can you speak to that a little bit?
I'm not sure I have all the information on that. I don't know. Katie, do you remember what that all entailed? Or that impairment, the substrate modification impairment?
So it's been a while since I looked into any of these specifically, certainly, but that is probably a remnant habitat, like kind of sediment related habitat listing that had been previously on the list and did not come off. We often, when we're first working in a watershed, will identify not just water bodies that are listed as impaired for sediment and reassess those, but also consider other water bodies that have kind of sediment related habitat listings, like that other substrate habitat alterations or physical substrate habitat alterations, causes associated with that water body, and not really treat them as if they're sediment impaired, but treat those sediment related habitat indicators as kind of a tip off that maybe we ought to look more closely at sediment conditions in that water body, and then do the you know, perform a sediment assessment. And if it's found to be assessed for sediment or impaired for sediment, often those existing listings will just stay on the list because they were there already, and obviously we couldn't delist them.
Okay, thanks, Katie. I did have a follow-up question though on that. So for Odell Creek, since it is a habitat listing, if that gets addressed in the WRP, does that make it eligible for 319 funding? And
It does.
asking is we've spent a lot of money on restoring Odell Creek, and it would be great if we could use those funds to match 319 funds to get some more work done in the lower end.
Yes, it does. I apologize for interrupting you. It does qualify it for 319 funding and could be used as match dollars.
Okay, thanks.
Are there other questions? Okay. I'm checking the chat real quick. See if we missed anything. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen again, and I'm just going to wrap up the presentation. This won't take long. Hang on, I'm having a malfunction here.
Christy, this is David Laufenberg again. Thanks so much for offering the background associated with the modeling efforts along those creeks. I'm really looking forward to seeing a lot of those stream summaries. Also, I think a lot of our stakeholders and just the general public in the Madison watershed will take a lot of interest in reading up on those, and it being available and digestible for laypersons is really valuable. I have a question. We've talked a little bit about how having a WRP enables a watershed to then apply for 319 funds. I'm wondering regarding the TMDL process and the impairment listing of streams, both those that have TMDLs and those that didn't have specific pollutants and therefore don't have a TMDL that is developed for them, such as like a Jack Creek. And I'm wondering about regulatory processes associated with streams that are recognized as impaired. And I'm wondering does DEQ take that into account when working with either developers or construction projects, what have you, that kind of thing. And I'm not sure if that's within your wheelhouse or not, but it is something of specific interest to the Conservation District.
This is Christina. Yes, that is taken into account if there's a project that requires a permit. Whether or not the stream is impaired can affect permit limits, if that answers your question.
Yeah, I think so. So I guess essentially what you're saying is if a stream is impaired, it may have stricter permitting requirements associated with an applicant looking to do work on that particular stream?
Yes, it could, or it may not, but yes, it could affect it.
Okay.
In the case of Jack Creek, since it's not impaired for a pollutant, I have to think about that a little bit more. I need to follow up with you tomorrow regarding a question that you asked earlier today, so I can follow up with you on this as well.
That sounds good. Yeah, it's a little bit of a different subject, but I thought I'd throw it out there right now anyways as we're kind of rolling through this stuff. So thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. It's good to ask. Okay, I've shared, let me know if you can't see this. I hope that I've shared my screen again. I just want to wrap up the presentation. This won't take too long. The next steps for completing this document. Currently, it's out for your review and comment. We've requested your comments by the end of the week, but I realize that this is a holiday weekend coming up. So you still have the opportunity to submit comments during the formal public comment period, which we plan to run for 30 days for this project. We're expecting that to start the middle to end of July and run to the middle to end of August. Any comments that you submit by the end of this week, we will definitely review and address before the document goes out for public comment. And any comments that are submitted after the end of this week, we can't guarantee that we'll be able to get to them before we put the document out for public comment. And what that means is, based on your comments, if we think edits are needed to the document, we'll be able to make those and incorporate them before we put out a revised version for public comment. During the public comment period, we will hold another meeting, a public meeting, which will also be via Zoom. That meeting will be a little less technical. We won't go into quite as many of the details as we did today. We also plan to record that meeting and have it available on the project website. After the public comment period is complete, all formal comments that we received, which means written comments, they get reviewed, and we write responses to those comments, which get included into the TMDL document. We make any final edits, and then we submit the document to the US EPA for their approval. Once we receive approval, we'll post the final document on our website. So I want to talk a little specifically about what's actually in the document. It's divided into 3 parts, which looks a little different than some of the other TMDLs that we've put out before. We've talked about all 3 of these parts today, but part 1 includes a project overview that's much more detailed than what we went over today. There's also a description of the full planning area, which includes quite a few maps and a lot more detail than we talked about today. There's a review of the temperature and sediment water quality standards, and there's a more detailed overview of the components of developing a TMDL and defining those. Part 2 is the technical details that contain the sediment and temperature components, which talk specifically about the source assessments that were completed, how the TMDLs were developed, and their allocations. This is the section or the part that will also include the public comments and our responses. But that won't be included until the final document, of course, so you won't see that in the next version of the document. Part 3 is probably the part that's of most interest to most people. That's the water quality improvement recommendations. There is a section, section 8.0, that covers the non-pollutants that Christy talked about. These are the alterations to streamside vegetation and in-stream habitat alterations, as well as flow modifications. Then there's the water quality improvement plan and monitoring for effectiveness sections that I talked about. And again, the stream summaries document will be a separate document, but it will be published at the same time as the final TMDL document. So I want to show you fairly quickly the project website. And hopefully, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and then reshare to do this. Okay. The link that I sent out in the email takes you directly to the Madison project page, but this is the link in the presentation takes you to a home page where there's information on all of the, almost all of the water quality planning projects that we have going on. And you'll see a sidebar to the right, and here you can navigate to the Madison. This is the Madison homepage. There's a table of contents in the top left that tells you what's on this page. There's a project area description with a map and a couple of photos to give the reader a general idea of the watershed. We have a picture of the West Fork on the left and Odell Spring Creek on the right. There's a table that shows which TMDLs we're currently developing and a map of those. And below that is the TMDLs that are included in the nutrient, E. coli, and metals document that was put out last year. And at the bottom of the page is all the project contacts. Jumping back to the top of this page, There's a link here for the project outreach, and this is where the document is located. The first thing that's on this page is a table of all the meetings and presentations that we've done in the past for this project. They start in 2015. There's a line here for today's meeting. Currently it has the Zoom information, but tomorrow it will have a PDF of the presentation we gave today, and I hope to have the recording up on the site tomorrow. It might take a day for the recording, but I hope to have that up tomorrow. The document is next in this table. The main document is here in the first row, and this outlines everything that's in it. And below that, we have 10 appendices for this document, and they can be downloaded here. Everything's in PDF format and has been compressed. On the right, it tells you where to submit comments. You can send them to me to my email address. If you have any trouble downloading the document or have questions, please contact me. My contact information is at the bottom of this page. If there's any trouble with email, you can give me a call and leave a voicemail, and I will return your call. This is the number to my office phone, and I'm working remotely. So if you leave a voicemail, I will return your call promptly. And I think that covers everything for this presentation. Start my video again. Okay, are there any final questions? Okay, I will send a follow-up email out when the presentation is out on the project website, and I will also send an email notification when the public comment period starts. Thank you for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for hosting.
Thanks, you guys. Appreciate it.